where he is responsible for working on reforming reading instruction and developing the Common Core state standards for English language arts. He was responsible for gathering and synthesizing a lot of the research on text complexity, reading comprehension, and vocabulary for the new standards, and he was a member of the Common Core Standards English Language Arts Working Group. He has nearly 40 years of experience as a teacher at all grade levels, a principal, and a consultant. So he comes at this problem with a wealth of perspectives and experience. And David, we are very happy to welcome you today.
It's good to be speaking to everybody, even if the only thing I see is my computer. You might want to just take note, my email, and I'm always glad to answer questions, and also the website of Student Achievement Partners, which I will refer to throughout, that has a number of the resources that we'll be talking about today. And as we go along, I really welcome questions. I find that questions are a great way to make use of the webinar. And we had some already, I guess, pre-questions before we started. So I'm going to start out right away with those. And the first question was for some kind of recommendations for successful transitions to the Common Core State Standards. I know that many of you are familiar with the Basal Alignment Project, but I'm not sure that all of you are. And I think that the Basal Alignment Project is far and away the best way to transit to the standards. And what it is, well, many schools in California, well, I guess almost all in California, have a Basal, and many throughout the country. The questions for the Basal text, for the passages, were not made when the Common Core Standards were in effect. So therefore, they don't align with the Common Core Standards. So if you're using a current Basal, every single day that you're answering questions about a text, you're answering questions that are not aligned with the standards. So what Student Achievement Partners did in conjunction with the Council of Great City Schools was gather together curriculum leaders, district office, from district offices and schools throughout the country, and rewrote the questions for the passages in the Basals. We did not address the other parts of the Basals. We didn't address any phonics parts. We did it for grades 3 to 5. We didn't address any phonics parts, grammar, or any morphology parts, just the questions for the passages. Right now, there are over 5,000 teachers signed up across the country to use this. It exists for every major Basal, and all you have to do is join, and I gave, you search Join Edmodo, search for the Basal Alignment Project Group, and the code to join the group is right there. And then whatever Basal you're using, you can find the text that you're reading, and you can see the questions that we made. The power of this is that these are text-dependent, standards-aligned questions that teachers do every day. There's no better way to possibly learn this and learn how to make high-quality text-dependent questions than by doing it every single day. So this is like embedded professional development. The other part of it that makes it so powerful is the emphasis that we put on vocabulary, and we'll talk about vocabulary later on, but the Basals, the current Basals, would call out for instruction in the neighborhood of 10 words per week, and they wouldn't always pick the best words. If kids who are behind are going to catch up, they need to learn more than 10 words a week. And in our work with the Basal Alignment Project, what we did was we called out for instruction more than just 10 words. We called out in the neighborhood of 20 words a week. And we also gave teachers a system for teaching the vocabulary words, and we also talked about which words should get more time, which words should get less time. So it's a really well-developed approach to vocabulary, which I'm sure many of you know is essential to proficiency and has been known to be for quite a while now. Although the BAP project is with grades 3 to 5, if you're working with teachers in younger grades, second especially, or older grades in grades 6 to 8 with the anthologies that are often used, if you take a look at BAP, what we call the Basal Alignment Project, you can get a good sense of what text-dependent questions are like, and that would be a way to learn to make your own text-dependent questions, even though you're using a book which is not a 3 to 5 Basal. So that's the Basal Alignment Project, and I think it's the most effective transition that we've seen because, as I said, it's embedded professional development. One of the most direct things that you can do to transit to the Common Core standards at this point is K-2 read aloud with informational text. The standards clearly call for 50% of text to be informational text. With read aloud, it's kind of easy to do that because you don't have to go out and buy books for everybody. You just have to buy the books for one book for the read aloud. So if you could start right away with K-2 read aloud with informational text, at least 50%. And it wouldn't be terrible if you did more than 50% now because the chances are your kids in K-2 have not had 50% read aloud informational text all along. The standards on page 33 very clearly lay out how to go about that. It's not just jumping around from one subject to another. It's such as one week the space program, the next week explorers, the next week tree kangaroos, et cetera, et cetera. It's to find a series of texts within a topic, as is explained very clearly on page 33. So a phenomenal way to make the transition right now is to find, let's say you pick the Arctic, is to find 4 or 5 texts on Arctic environments, read those aloud over a period of a week or two, and that would be one excellent way to make a transition to the standards. It would be great if there was professional development for teachers as to what kind of questions to make and how to approach informational text if they haven't done that very much. But even if you can't do that right away, to just jump in and start with that as soon as possible is an excellent way to make this transition. The feedback that we at Student Achievement Partners have been getting as we go around the country is that really teachers are very happy to do this because it brings the world into their classroom in a way that it hasn't before. Read aloud could be done in older grades as well. The great virtue of read aloud is that it brings in much more complex academic vocabulary or Tier 2 vocabulary than what kids can deal with, what they read on their own in K-2 or what they read on their own very often in K-5. So you're exposing kids to more academic vocabulary, but you're also exposing them to more academic syntax, more complex syntax, both of which are essential to proficient reading. So those are a number of things you can start with transitioning, but we have some more. And again, questions are always welcome. Regular work with complex text in all grades. On our website, we have about a dozen examples of texts and lessons that we refer to as exemplars using complex text with different grades, mostly middle school grades, but not completely. And you can also see videos of teachers using those texts at commoncore.americaachieves.org, and as I said there's no www about that. This is a great way to start because, especially with the videos, you can decide. I have a video. I did 2 of these videos. I did one with a 5th grade text and one with a 2nd grade text. Not only do you see the videos of myself and other teachers, but you see the lesson plan, you see the student work, and you see the teacher interviewed on how they implemented complex text. To implement complex text when you have a class that has a variety of reading levels, you have to support it. And these exemplars show very clearly how you can support all students with complex text. And although they're laid out there, I'll just mention them briefly. Multiple readings of the same text develop fluency and also bring students in who are less fluent readers. In addition to that, some of the vocabulary is provided for the students, and that's a form of support. which we'll talk about more, and also some words are taught in context. So that, the multiple reading, the text-dependent questions, chunking the text into smaller parts, all of that supports students in transitioning to more complex text. This quote, I think, is a great quote, comes from Richard Feynman, a theoretical physicist, and the text that we use, one of the exemplars and where I do the video, is a memoir of Richard Feynman called The Making of a Scientist. And in that memoir, as part of it, he says, everything I read, I try to figure out what it really means, what it's really saying. And it's a great way to introduce kids to close reading, because what close reading is everything you read trying to figure out what it's really saying. And I think one of the mechanisms of support that doesn't get the attention it deserves is if we're asking kids to do this, to read more complex text, even with all this support, it's great to bring the kids in and to let them know that we're making this transition, that we're asking them to read more complex text, that they can do it, that we're providing support, and that everybody's doing it together. This was the second question. Please share any recent developments, interpretations for scaffolds, and supports in relationship to close reads for students reading well below grade level expectations. For example, students with disabilities and ELLs. There's not so many new, very recent developments, but in our work around the country, there's a few things that we've found to be very helpful with struggling readers. Instead of doing a pre-reading that is essentially a mini lecture where the teacher provides it orally or tells students, what some teachers are starting to do is take a pre-reading, is write up their own pre-reading at a simpler level and have the students read that. So if teachers feel students really do need a certain amount of background knowledge to read a text, and it's essential, rather than providing it orally, to provide it in writing and have the students read it. Another is preview rather than review. To take your struggling readers and instead of having them read the text afterwards, but rather to have them read it beforehand, so that they're seeing the text before and getting a preview rather than a review, so that when they come in and they do it with everybody else, they feel they're somewhat of an expert on that text. Lily Wong Fillmore, a specialist with EL, and you can just Google her name, or you could Google Juicy Sentences. What she does with what she calls Juicy Sentences is to support ELs and any struggling readers. Is she takes a very complex sentence on a daily basis, just one sentence, and works with a group of children, or sometimes with a whole class, to unpack that complex sentence. And that gives children every single day experience with more complex syntax, which is an essential part of dealing with complex text. One of the great issues with complex text is writing assignments where students have to go back, use evidence from the text, and answer text-dependent questions and do some kind of writing assignment, some kind of culminating writing assignment, very similar to what we're going to see from the consortia when the new tests come out. By far, the best source I've come across for supporting readers to do that is the book Writing for Understanding by the Vermont Writers Collaborative. It's available on Amazon. It's not terribly expensive. I think it's $15 or $20. And it's like it was written for the Common Core, except I think it was written about 10 years ago. I really think that's worth an investment school-wide. Okay, other scaffolds. If you do, and you'll see this, once again, you'll see this on our website, achievethecore.org. But just to go over again some of the scaffolds for struggling readers. Multiple reads are essential. Smaller chunks of text. Breaking the text, even though the text might only be 2 pages, breaking it up into smaller chunks really supports weaker readers and supports everybody with complex text. Some vocabulary might need to be provided, and that's okay. Even if you look at an SAT test or an ACT test, or any reading test, you'll find sometimes some of the words are provided that cannot be determined from context. But we also need to spend some time on words in context, and that often doesn't get done as much as it should. We want to get to the essential ideas. We want to get to more inference questions that involve critical thinking, and we don't spend as much time as we should on vocabulary and context. But if we don't do it, if we don't do it on a regular basis, how are children going to ever get better at it? So spending some time on vocabulary and context is essential. And it's in our exemplars on the website, and again, that's worth taking a look at. Group work and pair and share and any kind of group work is also a form of support. Intensive scaffolding and modeling of writing assignments, which is essential. If you take a look at the video that I did on the making of a scientist, 5th grade, as I mentioned, on the American Achieves website, the kids did a pretty good job on it. The teacher worked with them, I worked with them, and you can see that they got into the text and they were able to answer, despite it being a complex text, most of the questions. In fact, in groups, all of the questions. They had enormous problems with the culminating writing assignment. And that's because we didn't scaffold it enough. So modeling and scaffolding any kind of culminating writing assignment, and you see these in every single text in BAP, in the BAP project. There's a culminating writing assignment. There's some hints for how to scaffold it, and that's really essential. Another form of scaffold for struggling readers is working with everybody else. What we found is the kids are willing to rise to the occasion to do more complex text. But interestingly, and we didn't predict this, when there is some resistance from kids, it tends to be the more proficient readers. Not it tends to be, it virtually always is. And the reason for that, we think, is that complex text, asking kids for evidence, text-dependent questions, is kind of like changing the rules for the struggling reader, for the proficient readers, because they've been able to read the text, answer some more superficial questions, make personal connections, and they haven't had to work that hard. But when every question requires evidence from the text, and when the text is complex, they have to work much harder. So they kind of feel that we've changed the rules on them. The struggling readers, well, they struggle. That's what struggling readers do. The only thing different is they know that the text they're struggling with is not a dumbed-down text, and they see everybody struggling. So in this way, complex text, text-dependent questions, questions that can only be answered with evidence from the text, levels the playing field in a way, and that's important. Another scaffold that I realized I didn't put here, Appendix C of the standards, was samples of student writing, and really it was not the strongest part of the standards, and we've gotten a lot of feedback that they weren't great, and we agree. And we're having the people who wrote the Writing for Understanding book, the Vermont Writers Collaborative, are redoing Appendix C. And it's really a great example of how to scaffold text, complex text at a variety of grades, and that should be available on our website and probably on the official website for the standards sometime in November. So that's a great form of scaffolding. This was a wonderful question. During a close reading of a passage, what are some recommended instructional best practices for modeling a strategy or skill to support students in answering a text-dependent question if the students did not comprehend the initial question? And again, a very good question. Rereading or rereading aloud the relevant chunk of text. If the text is chunked, you can ask the student or the students to reread it. You can reread it with them and read it aloud, and have them read it aloud, which always helps with focus. You can ask the students to find the part of the chunk that they think addresses the question. You can ask if there are any parts of the chunk of text that you don't understand. And you can break the question up into smaller parts, which I think most teachers have, the information we've gotten back is that that's often very helpful. You can see if there is a word or words in the question that the students don't understand. Or you can see if answers to previous questions provide any help. Resources. I'm sure you're all aware that everybody wants resources to make these transitions to the Common Core standards. So what materials, curriculum will be available to support Common Core? Will teachers be able to preview sample assessment questions? Where might we look for supplemental resources to teach students thinking skills? So let's take a look at this. And I've mentioned some. Our website has more and more, especially the exemplar lessons and, as I said, the link to America Achieves. Both SBAC and PARC, and you can just Google them or go to their website, have released some sample test items. It's not a ton, but it's way better than nothing. A resource list of free or expensive resources soon will be available on our website. Will soon be available on our website, and will be in Educational Leadership in December in the online version. It's a list of resources, and if anybody wants a preview, I'd be happy to send you a chart, not the actual article, but which I can't do, but a chart that the article that lists many of those resources. Many of which we've talked about today, but some new ones as well. Thinking skills. This is important. Critical reading and thinking skills will only develop proficient readers if they go back into the text. There was a very interesting study, which I may have mentioned at the summer session, by Murphy and al., I think in 2006. And they looked at discussion-oriented programs, such as literature circles, reciprocal teaching, the Great Books program, the Paideia proposal, and they examined over a period of years, they addressed a number of questions. Did students speak out more in these discussion-oriented reading programs? Yes, absolutely. Did teachers speak less? Yes, absolutely. Were students more engaged? Yes, absolutely. Did they make gains in reading proficiency? No. Across the board, no. And the conclusion that the authors came to was that thinking about it, critical thinking, discussing, do not make you a better reader unless the critical thinking and the discussion are focused very carefully on the text. So whenever we think about critical reading and thinking skills, and I think I talked about this summer, it's got to be about the text, because that's too often that's not the case. And again, as we move along, I would love any questions. One question that came up right away is, will we be developing questions for 6 to 8 anthologies? I would love to know, and maybe West Ed could help with this. We would love to know how many districts. I know a lot of districts have the 6 to 8 anthologies, but we would love to know to what degree they're used. I think Student Achievement Partners, and we've had some discussions with Council of Great City Schools, if we can get some sense that schools really use these, I think we would like to start at some point, not right now, but maybe in the late spring, a basal alignment project for the 6 to 8 anthologies, because it has come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so David, I just maybe we can just ask people if they want to type in the chat. We have a lot of secondary, middle school and secondary folks on. If they are using them, they can just let us know via the chat. We can see what we get.
That would be great. That would be great. Vocabulary and complex text. I would always love to hear more about vocabulary instruction. complex text, and academic vocabulary. All right, take a look at this for a minute, because it's always good to know, if we're talking about text complexity, what are the features of complex text. So as you read through this list, take a look, think to yourself, what might be the two of these that are the most important? And there are two that by far are the most important. All right, I'll go through them. Most of these are fairly intuitive. Subtle or frequent transitions. The more an author jumps around, the more complex the text. And the less direct he is about this jumping around, the more complex the text. Multiple and or subtle themes and purposes. This is really important for everybody, but especially grade 6 and up. We're so used to the main idea, to the one idea, which may partly be a result of our living with tests for so long. But complex texts have more than one important idea, and they often have more than one main idea. They're going to have multiple themes and multiple purposes, and the more they have, the more complex the text. And it's good to just be aware of that and work with kids on that. Density of information. This is why informational text is more difficult than narrative text. That the more dense the information, the more complex the text. Unfamiliar settings, topics, or events. One of the great failings, I believe, with our literacy education over the past, I would say, since the early 90s, is the emphasis not only on narrative text, but on narrative text with settings and topics and events that are familiar to students. If we want to develop their ability to read with strength, it's more likely to happen with texts that are unfamiliar, and topics that are unfamiliar, and events that are unfamiliar. It's very interesting when I'm doing a study with looking at 19th century readers, like, the old McGuffey readers, and there's no contemporary fiction. There's almost no contemporary fictions. There's classical literature, there's essays, there's a lot of poetry, which is great for teaching reading, but there's very little contemporary narrative fiction. Now, there wasn't as much written for kids then, but there's almost none. Lack of repetition, overlap, or similarity in words and sentences. Some authors use the same types of sentences. They'll repeat words or words that are related to each other, so it might be song in one sentence, singing in another, musical in another. They try to repeat themselves in a way. They might not do it deliberately, but they do repeat or they do overlap a similarity, because if words are similar and sentences are similar, very often the ideas are similar. And the less you have of that, the more difficult or complex a text. Complex sentences. The longer the sentence, the more complex, the greater the number of longer sentences, the more complex the text. But sometimes short sentences can be complex as well. You might ask yourself what a lot of kids do when they see short sentences. Whenever I ask teachers that, they say the kids tend to skip them because they don't think they're that important because they're short. So very often we have a situation where kids skip the short sentences. They skip the long sentences because they're too complex or too difficult. And so we have the Goldilocks effect. The only sentences they really focus on are the ones that are just right. Uncommon vocabulary. I think that's very intuitive. The more uncommon the vocabulary, the more difficult, or the more complex. This next one is very important. Sometimes some authors pull things together more. They'll give you words that will help glue the text together, such as because of this, or as a result, or consequently, or now we can see. Or they'll deliberately review. Go back and take a look at what we said earlier, or as the characters, as we saw from what the characters did earlier. So they try to pull things together in a variety of ways. And when authors do that, it's less complex. When authors don't do that, it's more complex. Longer paragraphs, definitely throw kids. And any text structure which is less narrative. And the more story-like the structure, the simpler. The less story-like, more complex. And any text which mixes structures, which will go very quickly from compare and contrast to descriptive, chronological, to problem solution, to goal, action, outcome. Any text that, mixes structures tends to be very complex. And the most common type of text that does that is a text that we've all lived with all our life, and that's a textbook. Use of passive voice. I think you've probably heard that we're not supposed to do that when we write, but a passive voice makes text more complex. So these are all of the features of complex text, but they're not all equal in causing student difficulty. In terms of causing student difficulty, there are two that are outstanding. And it's not that they're not all important. I like to compare it to Animal Farm. When Napoleon took over the farm and had a meeting of all the animals, and one of the animals said, I thought we were all equal. And Napoleon says, we are, but some of us are more equal than others. Well, all these features of complex text are important, but there are two that cause students more difficulty, and that's vocabulary and syntax or complex sentences. Now, let's just start with vocabulary. I think it's important to ask yourself, in your school system or in your school, how much attention is paid to vocabulary? If it's more important than anything else in causing student difficulty, and there's abundant research for this, you would want to ask yourself how much time gets spent with vocabulary, but also, does your school have a coherent, unified, systematic approach to vocabulary from beginning to end? Or is everybody just teaching vocabulary in a variety of ways? I mean, do this little thought experiment. Somebody goes up to you or goes up to one of your teachers and asks them to talk about their literacy program. They'll talk about the basal. They may talk about literacy in the content areas. They may talk about fluency, which would be good, actually, but it's rare that they would talk about their vocabulary program or how they approach vocabulary. So that's something to think about. Syntax. Very few schools spend much time on syntax. How much time do we spend helping kids unpack longer sentences? Do we do activities where we ask kids to paraphrase longer sentences, where we ask kids to break up longer sentences into shorter sentences, which can be done starting in first or second grade? It's very rare to find schools that do that. And we've asked thousands of teachers, and almost no one came up with saying that their school had any kind of coherent program with syntax. It doesn't mean you have to go back to diagramming sentences. It just means you have to pay attention to it. And with complex text, that would be pretty easy. That would be pretty easy to do. So those are two things to think about. A paper covering some of this is going to be on our website, some of which I've delved into now. I think I've addressed why vocabulary is so essential. There's two ways to increase vocabulary: volume of reading and direct instruction. A volume of reading can come in a variety of ways. Reading in social studies, science, and literature would certainly be one. But that means really reading. It can't be the kind of reading that we often have in science and social studies, where students are asked to read pages 37 to 39, answer questions 2, 4, and 5, and the kids skim to find a section that answers those questions, and then if they're fairly verbal, they paraphrase it, and if they're not, they just copy it. But if we have more focused reading in social studies and science, then we're going to have a wider volume of reading, and volume of reading is essential to growing vocabulary. Regular close reading. If close reading is done on a regular basis, that becomes a volume of reading as well and will also increase vocabulary. Accountable independent reading. Reading where kids choose what they read, the old drop everything and read or SSSR, etc., but where kids are held accountable in a variety, in whatever formats it is. Some schools do it with journaling. Some schools do it with conferences. Some schools do it with Accelerated Reader, which is a computerized program that gives kids quizzes on books that they've read. It's some form of accountable reading. Reading aloud is still a volume of reading. When you read aloud to children, you're enhancing vocabulary, you're enhancing syntax, and it's a volume of reading. And with the focus in the Common Core standards on academic vocabulary, on more complex text, reading aloud is something that we really need to look more closely at. Vocabulary and complex text, direct instruction. This is through close reading or through other means. We need to do more words than we usually do. If we're going to catch kids up, if a kid is in the fifth grade and they have a third grade vocabulary, if we want to catch them up, they have to master the third grade vocabulary, the fourth grade vocabulary, and since the fifth grade is not staying still, they have to master the fifth grade vocabulary. That's not going to happen unless we teach more words than we usually teach. But the only way we can do that is if we know which words to teach, and that is words that are essential to the text, words that are abstract, and words that are part of a word family. In addition to knowing which words to teach, we need to know which words take less time. Some words which are concrete and can be visualized don't take as much time to teach. If you're teaching kids what a porch is or a deck on a house, they might not know the word, but it's fairly easy to visualize and say what it is. But if it's more abstract, then it takes more time. And a lot of this is in the paper that we're putting on our website. And two other places to get a ton of information on how to do this are Andrew B. Miller's work, and especially his book, Words Worth Teaching, and Freddie Hebert's site, the Text Project, which is textproject.org, which I know a lot of you know. A lot of information on which words do we teach and how do we teach them. So that's a great place to get information. And also on our website, we're going to have a paper addressing just this. We recommend in the Basal Alignment Project a minimum of 20 words a week, and many of the passages involve more than 20 in the course of a week. So that's something to consider. Word study. There is just a slew of research. If anybody wants to look it up, most of it is done by a psychologist named Chuck Perfetti, P-E-R-F-E-T-T-I, showing that proficient readers don't just know the meaning of words. They know the phonology, or how to pronounce it. They know the orthography, or how to spell it. They know the morphology, or what prefixes, root words, prefixes, and suffixes. And they know what part of speech it is. Anytime you teach vocabulary, it's beneficial, therefore, to focus on word study. But I also think schools would do well to think about word study programs. It's very difficult to have a coherent word study program in a school without some kind of program or book. What prefixes do you teach in third grade? What suffixes do you teach in fourth grade? What root words do you introduce in fifth grade? It's very difficult to get everybody on the same page on that without having a word study program. Every major publisher has a word study program. They don't sell as much as they should, but McGraw-Hill has one, Zahner-Bloch has one. Both of those are excellent. I've seen them, McGraw-Hill and Zahner-Bloch. I think that's how it's spelled or pronounced. And those tend to be, those are books with a lot of activities, but they're very well-grounded, very research-based, and they really require on the part of the kids a lot of thinking. They're not like rote work at all. If you're not interested in that kind of program, Words Their Way is a much more involved program that involves more teacher preparation, but it's not in a workbook format. It's also an excellent program. And Wordly Wise, published by the EPS, Educational Publishing Service, is also an excellent program. So word study programs are definitely something to consider. origin of the shifts. This was a good an important question. Where do these shifts come from? That is, I find nowhere in the standards documents where it narrows down the focus of the shifts to the 3 ELA shifts that I've seen presented repeatedly. Whose interpretation of the Common Core State Standards documents are the shifts? Achieve the core? Well, yes, they are. It does come from the standards writers at Achieve the Core. And it's interesting to look at why. Building knowledge through content-enriched nonfiction. The reason for that is the standards make very clear, and it also comes from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that nonfiction and informational text are now going to be a much larger part of our literacy work. In addition, page 33 of the standards clearly outlines how that needs to be done. In high school and middle school, we now have literacy standards in these areas. It's sometimes important to remember that these are not ELA standards. The Common Core State Standards are ELA/literacy standards, meaning literacy in science and social studies. And that's pretty new. And that's why we have this emphasis, or we chose to have this emphasis, on content-rich nonfiction. The evidence standard. Standard 1. Every grade begins with the evidence standard. And there's a comparable standard in the writing standard. So evidence is highlighted throughout the standards. Text-dependent questions are questions that can only be answered with evidence from the text. And that's pretty much why we've done that and why we recommend that. Complex text. Standard 10 is the complex text standard. It demands students to be able to read independently and proficiently text at grade level complexity. So that's never been a standard before. It's never been a standard, and I think you all know it's going to be a lot of work for all of us to bring students to the ability to deal with more complex text. So another way of thinking about the shifts is that although the standards don't explicitly state the shifts in this way, they're clearly implied by the standards. And they revolve heavily around Standard 1 and Standard 10. You could almost think of those as power standards, because Standard 1 is the evidence standard, and every other standard requires evidence. And Standard 10 is the text complexity standard. If you have a student who masters all of standards 2 through 9, but he or she masters them with text that is not of grade level complexity, then how many standards has that student really mastered? They've mastered none. To really master the standard means you have to master it with text at grade level of complexity. And the reason for that is the ACT research, which many of you have seen and familiar with, or many of you may have heard me speak about, shows very clearly, as well as numerous other studies now, that the ability to read complex text independently and proficiently, exactly as it states in Standard 10, is the most effective predictor of success in college work. And that's the reason for that emphasis. So I think we're going to stop now and take some questions. So,
great. David, one that came in to just the host was for secondary sites, the English classrooms lack a well of expository text passages with lexical density. Is there some free resource that teachers could use to find passages?
Did the question mention a grade?
Just said English classrooms secondary.
Okay. So a source for expository, a source for informational text at the secondary level, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, the anthologies that we talked about early, although they're mostly narrative fiction, do have some expository text. So that would be one. Another source or would be to any kind of, at the English, the thing I always get this question for science and social studies more than I do for the English class. I think if we think about informational text as essays and speeches, then essays and speeches on any given topic could be very helpful. One way to think about this, in some work we're doing in developing units of instruction, teachers were doing Romeo and Juliet, and in the 7th grade, which is certainly complex, and they wanted to integrate more informational text. So they went online and they got informational text that had to do with tribalism by doing a search for tribalism, and also, they referred to it as raging hormones, which also has a lot to do, I guess, with Romeo and Juliet. So I think one way is to think about combining your narrative text with your informational text. So if you're reading a certain narrative text, you might want to do a search for expository topics that are related to those texts. And the best way to find that is the national databases such as EBSCO or Gale, and any librarian in your district can help you navigate the national databases. And if you do a search on any topic, you'll get a huge number of informational texts. And I think it's in EBSCO, it may be in both, many of those texts are now lexiled. So you can actually get the complexity level. We will put on our website, if it's not there already, how to find it exactly. In fact, we will put on our website how to do this. If you don't have a librarian, or if your librarian has been cut and you can't get to one, we will put on our website a series of screenshots, which we actually have, as to how to use the national databases to search for articles on any topic, and then after you find those articles, how to upload those to the Lexile Metametrics website and get a Lexile on it. If you're working at the secondary level, some topics are going to online versions of Harper's and Atlantic and the New Yorker. I don't think they put all their articles online, but all of them put some of their articles online. That's Harper's, Atlantic, and the New Yorker, and of course the New York Times. A fabulous one, in fact, which I've been using for my work, is a little periodical called The Week, W-E-E-K, that comes out every week. And they have an end section that has some fabulous, short, complex pieces. They're all expository text, and a lot of teachers have grabbed onto those.
Great.
So that's what comes to mind right away. It's an important question, and I know there's going to be more of them. More resources will become available. And don't forget the anthologies. The middle school anthologies will have roughly 20% informational text, and then you'll have them in your schools, and they're free.
Great. And just staying with the secondary theme, another question that came in is, do you advocate reading orally in secondary content area classes?
In the same way that we do our exemplars, where we read out loud, ideally, where we read out loud a text, but the students have the text in front of them and follow along. And the reason for that is that develops fluency. That's one of the two only effective ways to develop fluency. If a student hears a text being read out loud proficiently and fluently and follows along. So that's a great, we recommend that highly. In terms of content area, just reading the text out loud with the students not following along, it would be far more preferable to do it with the students having a copy of the text in front of them whenever possible.
Great. And then another question that came in earlier is, during read-alouds, what strategies do you recommend for students to pull the cognitive?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. The question is, during read-alouds, What strategies do you recommend for students to pool the cognitive?
The students what?
To pool the cognitive.
To pull, P-O-O-L?
P-U-L-L.
Oh, to pull the cognitive. I think that it's very similar to if you're not reading out loud. While you're reading out loud, think to yourself or prepare in advance those portions of the text that are most difficult, that will throw your students for a loop. Stop, reread those sections, and ask a question about them. One way to do that, especially if you're reading aloud, you don't want to stop too much, because I think kids love reading aloud, and I think many of us love reading aloud, is if you're reading aloud for 20 minutes in a session and you're done, but you go back to a section that you already read that is a key section of the text or a very complex section of a text, and then ask questions about that and give the kids a chance to turn and talk or wrestle with it themselves rather than just calling on hands, and then address that portion of the question, of the text. It's pretty much like a standard think aloud. The difference being that you want the kids to wrestle with those complex portions of text on their own as much as possible before you demystify it for them or explain it for them. So the techniques that you would use would be really identical, well, pretty much identical to the techniques in close reading of complex text that you see on our website. And I would also, as I said, recommend keeping the flow of the text going and coming back to the more difficult portions after you've reached a certain point. These are really good questions, by the way.
Great. I think we'll take one more and then we'll move on. How are you approaching closed reading with science teacher in high schools? What type of reading outside of the textbook are you recommending for them to include in their curriculums? The suggestions you have just made are good, but what other approaches would you make particularly for science teachers?
All right. Well, this is one of the great passions of my life, because I love reading about science, and it is tough. It is tougher in science. Science texts are more complex, and as well as that, there's a lot that we have to cover that does not bode well, does not do well with the text. Two things. The first part is similar to what I've been saying. Finding articles that connect to what you're teaching and approaching them in the same way. I'm doing a workshop with all of the science and social studies teachers in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. And anybody who wants to can email me, and I'll send you the text that I'm using. And one of them is from Michael Pollan's book, The Carnivore's Dilemma. And it's just perfect for middle school and maybe ninth grade as well. And it's loaded down with science, but it's excellent writing. So one answer to the question is to find articles that connect to your topic and do it the same way you see the exemplars done on our website. And I have about two or three of these science ones that I have 5 or 6 now that I've gotten from some for middle school, from Science News for Kids, and for high school from Science News, and that I'd be glad to share with anybody. Secondly, in my continual quest to deal with this problem, I actually read, while just about 15 minutes before this webinar, from a physics text, because I figured if you can do this with a physics textbook, you can pretty much do it with anything. And it was very clear that those books are not written very well. They're complex because they're not written very well, which is a shame, but that's the way it is. But they are excellent for close reading. And every chapter begins with a fairly text-based explanation of what's coming up. And so you could do close reading for just 5 or 10 minutes every day with the beginning of the chapter where you really want the kids to understand what's being said, because usually it gets explained by the teacher. So I think you have 2 avenues that you could approach with that. And again, anybody is welcome to email me, and I'd be glad to share with you what I've done with these science exemplars, and I would love your feedback.
Excellent. So why don't we let you go ahead and move on, but we will have time for more questions. And Catherine, I'll table your question for now, and then we will get David back on some questions in just a few minutes.
Okay, we go until when?
About another half an hour, about
Okay.
20 more minutes, 25 more minutes.
Okay, we're in good shape then. Oh, I got to go back. Balanced literacy, and I realized when I made this question that in California, I think it's still the rule that every elementary school has to use a basal, right? But in terms of schools that are doing balanced literacy or guided reading type approaches, one thing that, or maybe using a guided reading type approach integrated with the basal, is to bring your complex text that you're reading into guided reading. In other words, take your guided reading. It's something to think about, is to take your guided reading, your text that you're reading, if you find a complex text and you're reading it, and it could be a social studies text, and I'm talking now about elementary school, but maybe also middle school to an extent. And if you've got groups reading from your basal or otherwise, take that social studies or that science text and have kids do it in their guided reading groups. By doing that, you can focus more support with the students who need it, and the students who don't need as much support can read more independently. So that's something to think about with the use of reading groups. In other words, to use your reading groups, instead of using your reading groups maybe for not only for the basal, but also using your reading groups for the complex text that you've chosen. So let's say you've chosen a complex text from social studies on, or let's say science in the 4th grade on marine mammals, and it's a pretty complex text. You read it together with the whole class, students following along. You use many of the procedures on our website with chunking the text, giving some vocabulary in context, multiple readings, but then you break the kids up into groups, and you take the groups that need the help the most, and you spend more time with them, and the other groups that don't need as much help go on to read the text or do the culminating assignments more on their own. So it's like bringing guided reading into complex text and the Common Core, and we've been recommending things like that to schools, and actually have gotten some pretty positive feedback, but it's pretty new. And anybody who does something like that, I would love any kind of feedback on it. Okay, a bigger shift. And this was a quote from a teacher at a workshop, and I mentioned this in our work this summer. And it's a great quote. The idea is that we've considered, and I really mean all of us, myself very much included, in many ways, to be successful if we smooth the road for our students. And the Common Core, the biggest shift of all with the Common Core, is we're asking instead to judge our success by giving kids tools so that they can navigate these roads on their own. And if you just think about it, in many 6th grade classes, to use the 6-1 example, there are kids who read at a 3rd grade level. And yet we're now going to give them text that is more complex than what used to be 6th grade text. And that's definitely a shift throughout the country. And I think that one way to think about that is what are the tools that we're giving students? One is the opportunity to learn regularly from complex text. This is essential. What we've been saying in middle school and high school, and I'll drop it down to elementary school in a minute, is if the social studies teacher and the science teacher does one reading a month of complex text, they take, let's say, 3 or 4 days, and they focus on a complex text. Or, in the example of textbooks that I gave, they spend 10 to 15 minutes every period with a close reading of a part of the textbook. Then if that's done regularly in science, regularly in social studies, once a month in science, once a month in social studies for 3 or 4 days, and if it's done in ELA classes or English classes at least once a month, then the kids are reading complex text almost every week. And if they're doing that, they're going to make, it's hard to envision them not making progress with complex text, not making progress with mastering the syntax, with mastering the vocabulary. The opportunity to learn from informational text. You know the numbers, 50% in elementary school, 55% in middle school, 70% in high school. Informational text is more complex and more difficult for our students than narrative. By asking them to do this, which is a challenge for them and for us, it's giving them those tools. This next one is really important. Questions versus think-alouds. With think-alouds, teachers often find a difficult or key point of a text, and then they provide the answer to that, how to deal with that. They do the think-aloud that does the thinking for the students. What we've been suggesting is not to do that, but rather, when you come to the most difficult or the key points in a text, frame that in a question, have the kids wrestle with it. They might not get it all right, even if they do it in groups, but after they've wrestled with it, then provide what you might call the think aloud. It makes a great deal of difference when the kids have first thought about that. In relating that to science and social studies, especially in the high school, science and social studies teachers, middle school and high school, often say, and I understand this, it's a justifiable question, I don't have time to do this. I have to cover a certain amount of topics or a certain amount of content. But what we're finding is that the teachers who do this get back to us and they say, you know, this year I taught the Declaration of Independence by a close reading of the Declaration. It took me over a week. But the kids knew it much better than any other year when I did it by a combination of videos, small group work, and lectures. And we would always ask them, why? Why do you think they knew it better? Or they learned it better? And the reason is, if you have to read the Declaration of Independence, as complex it is, you've got to work really hard at it. And what we work hard at, we remember, and we understand, and we learn. So taking time out to do complex text and to learn from informational text does not mean that we're learning less. It may very well mean, in fact, that we're learning more. Leveling the playing field with text-dependent questions. By having questions that are evidence-based, that can only be answered by evidence in the text, which is what text-dependent questions are, by doing it that way, you're leveling the playing field. Whenever you go outside the text, you privilege those kids who have those experiences outside the text. When everything is inside the text, you're leveling the playing field, which supports our students who tend to need our support the most. Another tool is reading aloud of complex informational text, regularly, and especially kindergarten to second grade. I've taught I'm so old, I've taught almost every grade. But even when I taught in private schools for a few years before I went to started teaching in Harlem, I would read aloud every week. When I was teaching sixth grade, we would do science fiction because that's what the kids really grabbed onto. It was very complex. They loved it. I loved it. In the school that my wife and I ran, the public school in Harlem, our curriculum had read aloud as a regular part of K to 8. And it was a part of the day that teachers and students I'm sorry, I think I switched the teachers and students always look forward to. I discovered when I was teaching history at community college, in one of the course was the American West, and I opened up the course by reading aloud from a traditional account of Western expansion compared with a very non-traditional account by a historian called Howard Zinn. And the goal was to get at the different perspectives and the different ideology behind each perspective. And at the end of the class, students wanted to know if we were going to read aloud regularly. People like to be read aloud to. The great advantage now with the Common Core standards is, especially for elementary school, it's exposure to complex text that comes from read aloud. That can't be with text that students read themselves. So these are all tools we can give our kids now to navigate the road that we're asking them to navigate. Okay, I think we're ready for more questions.
Okay. So one, I don't think you're going to be going into any more slides. The question that came in the last question period was, will you be addressing various strategies for close reading, or if you have resources?
Close, C-L-O-Z-E?
Well, it's spelled C-L-O-S-E, but I think it's...
Close reading.
Yep.
Well, some of the slides have addressed that. The best way to get a handle on close reading is to go to the website. We have about a dozen texts that are extended lessons on close reading. I myself have another 5 or 6 or so, or maybe more, that aren't on the website yet that I'd be glad to address, glad to send to anyone. And other than that, I would repeat the same things I said. Close reading has to have multiple reads. It has to have evidence-based or text-dependent questions. It has to have short, complex texts. And the text should be chunked when the kids address the questions, so that when you're asking a kid to address a question in a complex text, he's addressing it for a shorter chunk of text, a paragraph, not a half a page or a whole page. You have to provide some of the vocabulary, but you also have to ask kids to address some of the vocabulary in context and figure out the meaning of the words. I really recommend doing as much group work as possible, and I really recommend having a culminating assignment at the end of close reading that integrates writing. And as the standards call for on page 5, by integrating reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you're also providing more avenues for kids to access complex text with close reading. But again, the website has 12 examples of this that really flush it out in great detail. And the Basal Alignment Project gives you a very good sense of it, even though the texts in the basals are not as complex sometimes as we would like, but sometimes they are. If you look at the questions that are made on the Basal Alignment Project, which looking at the first slide you can see how to get to, or the second slide, that's also a great way to learn about close reading, and especially close reading of complex text.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in is, in a balanced literacy scenario, how and when do struggling readers learn on grade level standards?
Well, this is what I was getting at before, what we've been doing a lot of thinking about. If you've got a balanced literacy program, you usually have guided reading. The guided reading that you usually have are leveled readers, whether it's Fontes and Pinnell or another source. Those are not Common Core complexity levels. Those are at the student's level. Mm-hmm. What we're thinking about, what we've been suggesting, is to use guided reading groups as further support for the complex text. So, as I said earlier, the complex text might be introduced whole class with all of the support that I just mentioned, but then in your guided reading groups, you can go back to that close complex text with the teacher working more with the students who need that support. Now, there is a problem with that, in that that does take away some of the variety of texts that balanced literacy classrooms have. A balanced literacy library often has a multitude of texts at different levels. But one thing you could do is have an additional period of time where the students are using their are in their guided reading groups and are reading their leveled texts. So in a way, you're kind of like doubling up on guided reading. And what you're doing then really is providing more time for interaction with text. It's, as I said, it's almost a double up of or certainly an increase of guided reading. You would have it once with the leveled text and once with the more complex text. Now, the way that schools could find time to do that is choose social studies and science texts for their complex texts. Then they would have time to do that. This is a radical shift because it means more time spent with text. But since we've had an achievement gap that's lasted ever since we started measuring reading in the 1960s, early 1960s, maybe we need to spend more time, maybe we need to provide more time in the course of a day where kids are interacting with text. And by doing it this way, they can interact with texts that are at their level, and they can interact with texts that are complex, and there can be more support for those students who need it. We're writing a white paper about how to do this that will be on our website, and that anybody who's interested in it, I'd be glad to send them some drafts, and I would love people's feedback on this idea because it's very new, and I think it's very important.
Great. That was an excellent answer. So I think this will be the last question, David. It was a question that came in just to the host. When you talk about read aloud of complex information for grades K2, are you suggesting the students also have the text in front of them?
No, definitely not. This is text way above their complexity level. This is text that none of the children can access on their own. So if you're reading aloud a text in second grade as part of a sequence of text, as I described earlier, on Arctic environments, that should not be a text that kids can in any way easily access on their own. Now, of course, once you're reading the text out loud and the book is around, some of you more proficient readers are going to pick it up and start reading it. Some of your less proficient readers might look at the pictures, and that's okay. That's fine. But the text, it's not designed for the children to have it in front of them. It's designed to be much more complex than they could even follow along with easily.
Right.
One way to think about that is with kindergarten, or even first grade in the beginning of the year. The chances are that they're not going to be able to read anything on the Arctic very easily in the beginning of first grade for the most part. So it's designed for a pure read aloud.